I've always believed that respect is earned through actions, not titles or appearances. Perhaps that's why I never felt the need to correct my wife Celia's misconceptions about my career. To her, I was just Riley, her underachieving husband, with a mysterious job that barely paid the bills. Little did she know that the nobody she mocked in front of her co-workers was about to be revealed as someone else entirely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I met Celia 6 years ago at a charity gala in the city. She was working as an executive assistant for a senior partner at Wilson & Moore, one of the most prestigious law firms downtown. I was there representing my company, though I never specified exactly what my role was. She assumed I was just another mid-level employee, and I never corrected her. For context, I'm the founder and CEO of Meridian Technologies, a cybersecurity firm that works with government agencies and Fortune 500 companies. We operate discreetly by design. Our clients prefer we stay out of the headlines, and I've always valued privacy over publicity. Most of our contracts are confidential, our office is unmarked, and our employees sign extensive NDAs. This level of secrecy has become second nature to me, extending even into my personal life. When Celia and I started dating, I was in the early stages of negotiating the largest contract in my company's history, a deal that would eventually make me a very wealthy man. But I was raised to believe that character matters more than cash, and I wanted someone who would love me for who I was, not what I owned. "What exactly do you do?" she asked on our third date, picking at her salad and studying me with curious eyes. "I work in tech," I replied with a shrug. "Cybersecurity mainly. Nothing exciting." It wasn't a lie, just an understatement. I didn't mention that I'd founded the company after developing encryption software in college, or that I was currently overseeing a team of 80 employees. I certainly didn't mention that the nothing exciting part of my job had recently caught the attention of several major investment firms looking to acquire minority stakes in my company. Celia nodded, seemingly satisfied with my vague answer. She launched into a detailed description of her own workplace, the important clients, the high-profile cases, the office politics, and especially her boss, Amelia Barrett, a senior partner she clearly idolized. "Amelia says I have potential to move up quickly if I play my cards right," she said, eyes bright with ambition. "She thinks I could be running the executive floor in 2 years. I smiled, genuinely impressed by her drive. "That's great. You clearly have a strong work ethic." That pattern continued throughout our relationship. Celia would talk extensively about her job and aspirations, while I kept details about my work. Life deliberately minimal. When we got engaged a year later, she was still under the impression that I worked as some kind of mid-level technician or programmer. The wedding was small. My preference, though, I told her it was due to budget constraints. My closest colleagues attended, all of them carefully briefed to maintain the narrative that I was just another team member. My COO, Jack Morris, who'd been with me since we started the company in my garage, gave a best man speech that masterfully avoided any mention of my actual position. "To Riley," he said, raising his glass, "the most humble and hard-working man I know. Celia, you've found someone special, even if he'll never admit it himself." Celia interpreted this as a reference to my personality, not my professional achievements. She squeezed my hand under the table and whispered, "I know you'll do great things someday." Little did she know those great things were already well underway. The week after our honeymoon, I closed the contract I'd been working on for months, and Meridian's valuation quadrupled overnight. I could have told her then, revealed everything at that moment of success, but something held me back. Maybe it was because I'd grown comfortable with her perception of me as the steady, unremarkable husband. Or maybe, deep down, I was conducting a kind of extended test, waiting to see if she truly loved me, regardless of status or success. As the months passed, I watched Celia's career progress. She was promoted to executive coordinator, working directly under Amelia Barrett. Her salary increased, and with it, her confidence and ambition. She began attending more corporate events, networking dinners, and industry galas, often without me. "These events would bore you," she'd say, adjusting her designer dress in the mirror. "It's all legal talk and firm politics. Besides, you wouldn't know anyone there." I never objected. While she attended her functions, I would often be working late, sometimes flying to other cities for meetings with clients or investors. We developed a comfortable rhythm of parallel professional lives that rarely intersected. When we bought our house, a modest but nice place in a good neighborhood, I let her believe that her salary was carrying most of the weight. I secretly paid off half the mortgage up front, but structured it so the monthly payments seemed reasonable. On our supposed combined income, I transferred money into our joint account in small, regular increments that wouldn't raise eyebrows. "We're doing well for ourselves," she said one evening, reviewing our finances with obvious pride, "especially considering your field doesn't pay what it should." "We manage," I replied with a non-committal shrug. Looking back, I wonder if I should have been more transparent from the beginning. But something about Celia's fixation on status and hierarchy made me hesitant. She frequently categorized people by their job titles, income brackets, and connections. She'd come home from work full of stories about corner office people versus cubicle people, as though these workspace distinctions reflected some deeper truth about human value. I told myself I was protecting our relationship from materialism by downplaying my success. I didn't want to be valued for my money or position, but perhaps I was also protecting myself, creating a buffer zone of misinformation that would absorb the blow if Celia ever revealed herself to be someone different than I hoped. And slowly she did begin to change. Or perhaps the person she had always been simply became more visible as her career advanced. The first shift was subtle. She began making small comments about my clothes, suggesting I should dress the part if I ever wanted to advance in my career. "Riley, that shirt has seen better days," she'd say, plucking at my sleeve. "Don't they expect you to look professional at work?" I would smile and say something non-committal. The truth was, at Meridian, I had established a company culture where results mattered more than appearances. Some of our best programmers came to work in hoodies and jeans. I often did the same, saving the suits for client meetings and industry events, none of which Celia ever attended with me. Then came the comparisons. Celia began mentioning her friends' husbands with increasing frequency, highlighting their career achievements, promotions, or salary increases. "Carla's husband just made junior partner at his firm," she'd say over dinner. "They're looking at vacation homes in the Hamptons now." She'd pause, giving me a meaningful look. It must be nice to have that kind of security. I would nod and change the subject, swallowing the irony that burned in my throat. I could have bought 10 houses in the Hamptons without blinking, but that wasn't the point. The point was that these comparisons revealed something about how Celia measured value, and by extension, how she measured me. The comments grew more direct over time. When I missed a dinner with her colleagues due to a last-minute client emergency, she was coldly furious. "This is why you'll never move up, Riley," she said, pacing our bedroom. "You have no ambition, no networking skills. You're comfortable being a nobody." That word, nobody, it struck me like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because it revealed how Celia had come to see me, not as a person with inherent worth, but as a disappointment who had failed to climb whatever ladder she deemed important. I could have told her then. I could have pulled up the company website, shown her my name and picture under founder and CEO, or mentioned the industry award gathering dust in my office drawer. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I could have logged into our investment account and shown her exactly what kind of security we actually had, But I didn't. Instead, I apologized for missing dinner and promised to make the next one. As I lay awake that night, listening to her measured breathing beside me, I wondered how we had come to this place, where the woman who had vowed to love me for better or worse now saw me as simply worse, without ever having experienced the better I had deliberately kept hidden. I wasn't testing her anymore. I was afraid of what the test had already revealed. It didn't happen overnight. The cracks in our marriage started small, like hairline fractures in fine china that most people wouldn't notice at first glance. But over time, they widened, deepened, until they became impossible to ignore. At first, Celia's dismissive comments and sharp remarks stung, but I brushed them off. Marriage isn't perfect, I told myself. Everyone has bad days, moments of frustration that spill over onto the people closest to them. But with Celia, these moments weren't isolated incidents. They were becoming the foundation of how she saw me. "You really should be more assertive at work, Riley," she'd say, while scrolling through her phone during dinner. "Emilia says the tech department at her firm is getting completely restructured. The go-getters are being promoted, and the passive ones are being let go. That's just how business works." I'd nod and take another bite of my food, swallowing the irony along with it. Just that morning, I'd finalized the acquisition of a smaller security firm in Austin, bringing 30 more employees under the Meridian umbrella and expanding our service offerings significantly. The decision had been months in the making. Countless late nights, analyzing financial reports, multiple trips to Texas, and intense negotiations that I'd led personally. But to Celia, I was someone who needed basic business advice, someone who might be at risk in a corporate restructuring because I lacked assertiveness. The irony wasn't lost on me. Every day, I made decisions that affected hundreds of people's livelihoods. I navigated complex contract negotiations with government agencies and Fortune 500 companies. I led board meetings where millions of dollars hung in the balance. Yet at home, I was treated like someone who didn't understand how the professional world operated. It wasn't just her advice, though. It was her tone, the way her voice took on a particular edge when discussing my career, as if my work was somehow less legitimate than hers. She'd sigh dramatically when I mentioned a challenge at the office, or roll her eyes if I suggested a solution to one of her workplace problems. "You don't get it, Riley," she'd say. "Law firms are different. It's a completely different world than whatever you do with computers all day." That particular phrase, "whatever you do with computers all day," became a recurring theme. It was her shorthand for dismissing my entire professional existence as something vague and inconsequential, not worth the mental energy to properly understand or respect. The contrast between how my colleagues treated me and how my wife spoke to me grew increasingly stark. At Meridian, I was surrounded by people who valued my insight, who sought my guidance on complex problems, who trusted my judgment even in high-stakes situations. Then I'd come home to someone who treated me as if I were playing at having a career rather than actually building something meaningful. One evening, I was working late in my home office when Celia knocked on the door, already dressed in an elegant black cocktail dress. "I need you to hurry up and get ready," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "Emilia's dinner party starts in an hour, and we need to make an appearance." I looked up from my laptop, where I was reviewing a critical security protocol for a new government contract. I didn't know we had plans tonight. Her expression shifted from neutral to irritated in an instant. "I told you about this last week, Riley. It's important. Emilia doesn't invite just anyone to her home. I had no recollection of this invitation, but I didn't push the point. I can't tonight, Celia. I'm in the middle of something critical for work." She crossed her arms, her posture stiffening. "More important than my career? This is networking, Riley. Connections. The partners will be there. This could be a big opportunity for me." "I understand that," I said, trying to keep my voice level. But I have a deadline that can't wait. Real people's security is at stake. She let out a laugh, sharp, dismissive, cutting. Security? Riley, you check firewalls or whatever. It's not like you're protecting the nuclear codes. The project I was working on was in fact related to infrastructure security for a power grid, not nuclear codes, but not far off in terms of significance. But there was no point explaining that. In Celia's mind, my work was already categorized as unimportant, regardless of reality. I'll make it up to you, I promised, but tonight I need to finish this. She stared at me for a long moment, her expression hardening into something I barely recognized. This is why you'll never get ahead, Riley. No ambition, no understanding of how to play the game. She turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. Don't wait up. Some of us have real careers to manage. The door closed behind her with a decisive click. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the space where she had been, feeling a strange mixture of anger, sadness, and resignation. This wasn't just about tonight's party, or even about our different careers. This was about fundamental respect, and its absence was becoming too glaring to ignore. That night marked a turning point. I stopped making excuses for Celia's behavior. I began to catalogue each dismissive comment, each condescending remark, each moment where she made it clear that she saw me as somehow less than, less ambitious, less successful, less worthy of respect. The pattern was impossible to miss. At social events with her colleagues, she would introduce me briefly, then steer the conversation away as quickly as possible, as if my presence was something to be minimized rather than highlighted. If someone asked what I did for work, she would answer, for me, he's in IT, before changing the subject. When her law firm had a charity gala, she forgot to get me a ticket, then suggested it was for the best. It's mostly shop talk anyway, she said, not quite meeting my eyes. You'd be bored. I knew what she wasn't saying. You wouldn't fit in. You wouldn't impress anyone. You'd be out of place among successful people. Meanwhile, my own professional achievements continued to accumulate, invisible to the one person who should have been celebrating them with me. Meridian secured another major government contract. We opened a second office in Chicago. An industry publication named me one of the top 40 under 40 in tech security, featuring a brief profile that I made sure stayed off our company's socials. Media channels. Each milestone passed without acknowledgement at home, sealed away in the compartmentalized life I had created. I told myself it was better this way, that revealing the truth now, after years of omission, would only create more problems than it solved. But the emotional distance between us was growing, and I wasn't sure how much longer this precarious balance could be maintained. The breaking point came closer one evening when I received a call from my COO, Jack, about an urgent security breach. At one of our clients' facilities, I was in the middle of dinner with Celia when my phone rang. I have to take this, I said, standing up from the table. She sighed loudly. Really, Riley, we're eating. I stepped into the hallway and took the call, speaking in low, measured tones with Jack about containment protocols and response teams. When I returned to the table 5 minutes later, Celia was scrolling through her phone, her dinner half eaten and pushed aside. Everything okay at the help desk? She asked without looking up. It wasn't the help desk, I said, sitting back down. It was whatever, she interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. Just try to be present when we're having dinner. Not everyone has the luxury of checking out whenever they want. Some of us have careers where we're actually accountable to people. I stared at her, momentarily at a loss for words. In those few minutes on the phone, I had authorized an emergency response that would cost over 6 figures and involve a team of 12 specialists working through the night. People were, at that very moment, following my directives to protect sensitive data for thousands of individuals. If that wasn't accountability, I wasn't sure what was. But Celia had already moved on, telling me about some office politics involving Amelia and another partner at the firm. I nodded automatically, letting her words wash over me while my mind drifted elsewhere. When had she become this person? Or had she always been this way, and I had been too in love to notice? The woman I married had been ambitious, yes, but also kind and supportive. She had laughed at my jokes, asked about my day, celebrated small victories with me. Now it felt like I was living with someone who barely tolerated my existence, someone who had placed me firmly at the bottom of whatever internal hierarchy she used to organize her world. That night, lying awake beside her sleeping form, I made a decision. I wouldn't confront her directly, not yet, but I would stop hiding who I was at work. If Celia happened to discover the truth about my position, so be it. I was tired of living a half-life, of having my professional accomplishments dismissed by the person who should have been my biggest supporter. Little did I know that the opportunity for revelation was approaching faster than I anticipated, and it would arrive in a way I never could have predicted. The catalyst came on a Tuesday evening, at what was supposed to be a routine dinner with Celia's colleagues. Her law firm, Wilson & Moore, had just won a major case, and Amelia Barrett, now managing partner, had organized a celebration at Ellison's, an upscale restaurant downtown that typically required reservations weeks in advance. "You'll need to wear your navy suit," Celia informed me that morning, not looking up from her coffee. "The one we got for your cousin's wedding last year." I nodded, stirring my own coffee absently. "What time do we need to be there?" "7 sharp, and Riley—" She finally met my eyes. "Try to seem interested when people talk about the case. It's a big deal for the firm." Something in her tone made me pause. "I'm always interested in your work, Celia." She gave me a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just follow my lead tonight, okay? These are important people." The implication hung in the air between us. "Unlike you." I let it pass without comment, finishing my coffee in silence before heading to my home office. I had an early video call with our Chicago team that couldn't wait. That day was particularly hectic. One of our major clients was implementing a new security protocol we'd designed, and my team was on standby for any issues during the transition. By late afternoon, I was deep in troubleshooting mode when my phone buzzed with a text from Celia. "Don't be late. Meet at the restaurant." I glanced at the time, 4:30 p.m. I still had several critical tasks to complete before I could step away, but I knew Celia wouldn't accept work as an excuse for tardiness, not tonight. I texted back a quick confirmation and turned my attention to wrapping up as efficiently as possible. At 6:45 p.m., I was in an Uber headed downtown, my navy suit slightly rumpled from being hastily changed into. The security transition had hit some unexpected snags, and I'd had to delegate the remaining issues to Jack and the team. They were more than capable, but I still felt the weight of responsibility as I watched the city lights blur past my window. Arrived at Ellison's at 6:58 p.m., straightening my tie as I approached the Maître d'Eau. The restaurant was exactly as pretentious as its reputation suggested. Dim lighting, minimalist decor, and waitstaff who moved with practiced precision between the well-spaced tables. "I'm meeting the Wilson & Moore party," I told the hostess, who nodded and led me through the dining room toward a private area in the back. I spotted Celia immediately. She was standing near the center of a group of about 15 people, wearing a black dress I hadn't seen before, her hair styled in an elegant updo. She was laughing at something a tall, silver-haired man had said. One of the senior partners, I assumed. She didn't notice me at first, giving me a moment to observe her. In her professional element, she was animated, confident, her body language projecting an ease I rarely saw at home anymore. I felt a pang of something like nostalgia for the woman I'd fallen in love with years ago, before success and status had become her primary metrics for measuring value. I made my way toward the group, and Celia finally spotted me. Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before reassembling itself into something more measured, more controlled. "There you are," she said, reaching out to touch my arm lightly, a gesture that looked affectionate but felt perfunctory. "Everyone. This is my husband Riley." A few polite nods, some murmured greetings. Then Celia smoothly steered the conversation back to the case they were celebrating. I stood beside her, nursing the glass of wine someone had pressed into my hand, listening as they dissected legal strategies and courtroom maneuvers. Dinner itself was a carefully choreographed affair. I was seated between Celia and a junior associate whose name I didn't catch, while Amelia Barrett presided at the head of the table like royalty holding court. She was a striking woman in her 50s, with sharp features and calculating eyes that seemed to assess everyone's value to her in real time. "So, Riley," she said during the main course, her attention suddenly turning to me, "Celia tells me you work in tech. What exactly do you do?" I felt Celia stiffen beside me, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. For years, I'd given vague, minimized versions of my work when asked this question. Tonight, something in me resisted. The familiar script. "I run a cybersecurity firm," I said, meeting Amelia's gaze directly. "We design customized security protocols for government agencies and corporations." Amelia raised an eyebrow, seemingly intrigued by this slightly more specific answer than what she'd expected. "Interesting. What kind of—" "Riley's being modest," Celia interrupted with a light laugh. "He's part of the IT team at a security company, very behind-the-scenes stuff." She patted my hand in a way that felt patronizing rather than affectionate. "He keeps everything running smoothly so the executives can do their thing." I felt a flush of heat rise to my face. Not embarrassment, but a slow-burning anger that had been building for longer than I cared to admit. Before I could respond, Amelia had already shifted her attention to the senior partner across the table, asking him about an upcoming case. Celia leaned in close to me, her smile fixed, but her eyes warning. "Let's not oversell your job to the managing partner," she whispered, squeezing my thigh under the table. "It makes me look like I'm exaggerating your position." I took a long sip of my wine instead of responding, letting the conversation flow around me. The dinner dragged on, course after course, paired with wines I barely tasted. Throughout the evening, Celia controlled any interaction I had with her colleagues, jumping in to clarify my responses, redirecting questions aimed at me, or simply talking over me if I attempted to engage in any substantive discussion. By the time dessert arrived, I had largely given up on meaningful participation. I sat quietly, observing the dynamics around the table, the subtle hierarchies at play. Amelia clearly stood at the top, with everyone else orbiting her like planets. Around a sun, Celia was somewhere in the middle tier, eager to ascend higher, using the victory celebration as an opportunity to strengthen her position. Then came the moment that changed everything. Amelia stood, champagne flute in hand, to toast the team's success. After acknowledging the key players in the case, she shifted to discussing the firm's future. "This victory is just the beginning," she said, her voice commanding attention without effort. "Wilson and Moore is entering a new era of expansion. We're pursuing several high-profile clients in the tech sector who need specialized legal representation for complex security and privacy matters." I perked up slightly at this. Cybersecurity law was directly relevant to Meridian's work. We often collaborated with legal teams on compliance issues for our clients. "In fact," Amelia continued, "we're already in discussions with Meridian Technologies about potentially handling their legal affairs. Their CEO is a visionary in the security space, building a company that's revolutionizing how we think about digital protection." I froze, my dessert fork suspended mid-air. Meridian Technologies, my company, was indeed exploring new legal representation, but I hadn't been informed that Wilson & Moore was being considered. This had to be Jack's doing, possibly in collaboration with our legal department, moving forward on initiatives while I focused on technical matters. Celia was nodding along with Amelia's speech, clearly familiar with this potential client. When Amelia finished her toast, the conversation around the table turned to the tech sector and its legal challenges. "I've been researching Meridian extensively," one of the junior partners said. "Their approach to embedded security is groundbreaking. Getting them as a client would be a major coup." "Absolutely," another associate agreed. "Their CEO, Reed Parker, isn't it, is supposedly brilliant but intensely private. Barely any public appearances, no social media presence." I nearly choked on my water. Reed Parker was the pseudonym I occasionally used for industry publications when I wanted to share technical insights without drawing attention to myself or Meridian. It was an inside joke. Reed was my middle name, Parker my mother's maiden name. How it had become associated with my role as CEO, I had no idea. "Well, whoever he is," Amelia said with a slight smile, "his company is precisely the kind of innovative client Wilson & Moore wants to represent. Forward-thinking, growing rapidly, and with complex legal needs that justify our premium rates." Celia seized the opportunity to position herself. "I've actually compiled a comprehensive brief on Meridian's legal history and potential needs," she said, her voice carrying that confident edge she reserved for professional settings. "Their privacy work aligns perfectly with the strategy I developed for the Westfield case." I turned to look at my wife, genuinely surprised. She had been researching my company without ever mentioning it to me, all while continuously dismissing my own work as trivial. "That's the kind of initiative we value, Celia," Amelia approved with a nod. "Perhaps you should take point on the initial client contact." Celia practically glowed with pride at this recognition. "I'd be honored. I'm confident we can demonstrate to Meridian why they need Wilson & Moore's expertise. From what I understand, their current legal representation is inadequate for a company of their growing stature." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from responding. Our current legal team was actually excellent. We had deliberately chosen a smaller firm that specialized in cybersecurity law rather than a large generalist firm like Wilson & Moore. If we were considering a change, it would be for very specific, strategic reasons, not because our current representation was inadequate. The conversation continued around me, with Celia positioning herself as the resident expert on Meridian Technologies, my company, while I sat silently beside her, witnessing the surreal disconnect between my two worlds colliding without recognition. Then, the silver-haired senior partner turned to me with a dismissive glance. "What do you think about all this tech business, Riley? Must be strange hearing about companies like Meridian when you're on the, support side of things." Before I could answer, Celia let out a light, artificial laugh. "Oh, don't bother asking Riley about Meridian. He wouldn't know the first thing about a company at that level. He's more of a basic troubleshooting type." I saw several people exchange glances, their expressions a mixture of second-hand embarrassment and mild amusement at my expense. The table had gone awkwardly quiet. "No offense, honey," Celia added, patting my arm while addressing the table. "Riley's happy where he is. Not everyone needs to climb the corporate ladder." She lowered her voice conspiratorially, but still loud enough for everyone to hear. "Between us, he's a bit of a nobody in his company, but he's very reliable." The words hung in the air like a slap, a nobody. After years of small cuts, this was the deepest, delivered not in the privacy of our home, but in front of a tableful of professionals she respected, deliberately positioning me as someone not worth their consideration. I looked at my wife, seeing her clearly perhaps for the first time in years. The woman I had married was gone, replaced by someone who would casually humiliate her husband to elevate her own status. Whatever test I had been unconsciously conducting all these years, the results were finally, undeniably clear. And that's when my phone rang. The ringtone cut through the awkward silence that had descended over the table. I recognized it immediately, the specific tone I'd set for my executive assistant Lila. She never called after hours unless it was genuinely urgent. I glanced at the screen, then back at the table of legal professionals who were now watching me with barely concealed impatience. Celia's expression had hardened into something between embarrassment and anger. "I need to take this," I said, pushing back my chair. "Excuse me for a moment." "Riley," Celia hissed, her hand shooting out to grab my wrist. "Can't it wait? We're in the middle of dinner." I gently but firmly removed her hand. "No, it can't." As I walked away from the table, I heard Celia offering an apologetic explanation to her colleagues. "Sorry about that. He thinks every IT emergency is the end of the world." I stepped into the relative quiet of the restaurant's lobby before answering. "Lila, what's happening?" "Riley, I'm so sorry to interrupt your evening," she said, her voice tense with the professional urgency I knew well. "We have a situation with the DoD contract. They're requesting an emergency amendment to the security protocols following an attempted breach on a related system." I pinched the bridge of my nose, processing the implications. The Department of Defense was one of our most significant clients and one of the most demanding. "What's the timeline?" "They need sign-off tonight." "The amended protocols are ready for your review, but they require your personal authorization as CEO, not just the security team's approval. Legal has already cleared the language." I glanced back toward the private dining room where Celia sat, with her colleagues, all of them completely unaware that they were discussing a potential client whose CEO was standing 30 feet away. "Where are the documents now?" "That's why I'm calling," Lila replied. "I have everything prepared for your signature. I can bring them to you wherever you are. Jack said it's too sensitive for digital transmission, even on our secure channels." I hesitated for only a moment before making a decision. Maybe it was the culmination of years of dismissal, or maybe it was simply the right time for the truth. Either way, I was done hiding. "I'm at Ellison's downtown, the Wilson and Moore dinner." "The law firm?" Lila sounded surprised. She was one of the few people who knew about my unusual marital arrangement. "Isn't that where your wife works?" "Yes, her entire firm is here, including the managing partner. They're actually discussing Meridian as a potential client." There was a brief silence on the other end. "Well, that's quite a coincidence, isn't it?" I said, a strange calm settling over me. "Bring the documents, Lila. I'll sign them here." "Are you sure? I could meet you somewhere more private." "No, bring them to Ellison's. Ask for the Wilson and Moore party." After ending the call, I stood in the lobby for a moment, collecting my thoughts. For years, I had compartmentalized my life, keeping my professional identity separate from my marriage, allowing Celia to believe I was someone far less accomplished than I actually was. I told myself it was about finding authentic connection, about being loved for who I was, rather than what I owned. But standing there in that opulent restaurant lobby, I finally acknowledged the truth. It had become a test I was never going to let Celia pass. By hiding such a fundamental part of myself, I had created a marriage built on incomplete information and false assumptions. Yes, Celia had shown her true colors in how she treated someone she thought was beneath her, but I had never given her the chance to know the real me either. This realization didn't excuse her behavior, but it cast our entire relationship in a new light. We had both failed each other, just in different ways. With this clarity came decision. I would no longer hide who I was or what I had built. Whatever happened next, whether it salvaged our marriage or ended it, would at least be based on truth. I returned to the table to find the conversation had moved on to other firm matters. Celia shot me a look of barely contained irritation as I slid back into my seat. "Everything okay in the IT department?" she asked, her tone making it clear she expected a quick, minimal response. "It's being handled," I replied simply, taking a sip of my water. Amelia Barrett was discussing the firm's technological infrastructure now, lamenting their outdated systems. "What we really need is a complete security overhaul," she was saying, "especially if we're going to court clients like Meridian Technologies. We can't very well present ourselves as capable of handling cutting-edge tech legal matters when our own systems are vulnerable." "I suggested that last quarter," Celia jumped in eagerly. "My proposal included a phased approach to updating our entire digital infrastructure." "Yes, I remember," Amelia nodded. "The partners are reconsidering it now, especially with these new potential clients on the horizon." Celia straightened in her chair, clearly pleased at this recognition. I watched her, wondering what she would say if she knew I could solve Wilson & Moore's security problems with a single phone call to my development team. The conversation continued around me as I checked my watch discreetly. Lila was typically extremely efficient. She would likely arrive within 15 minutes, even in downtown traffic. I felt an odd sense of detachment as I observed the social dynamics playing out at the table, the careful positioning, the subtle competition, the constant awareness of hierarchy. Celia was in her element, skillfully inserting herself into every relevant discussion, name-dropping clients and referencing cases she'd worked on. She was good at this game, I had to admit. In another context, I might have admired her strategic networking. But the foundation of contempt she had shown toward me cast all her professional ambition in a troubling light. "Riley," the junior associate beside me said suddenly, breaking into my thoughts. "Celia mentions you work in IT. What's your take on these emerging security threats everyone's talking about?" I noticed Celia's attention snap toward us, her expression sharpening with concern. For the first time that evening, I decided to answer honestly, though still without revealing my full identity. The landscape is evolving rapidly. Most organizations are still using perimeter-based security models when they should be implementing zero-trust architectures and continuous authentication protocols. The associate blinked, clearly not expecting such a specific response. "That sounds comprehensive." "It's the direction the industry is moving," I continued, "especially for organizations handling sensitive information, like law firms." "Riley has a few certifications," Celia interjected quickly, her tone somewhere between proud and dismissive, the way someone might talk about a child who'd done surprisingly well at a school project. "He keeps up with the trends, don't you?" "Honey?" I met her eyes directly. I tried to stay informed, yes. Something in my tone must have alerted her that something was different. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face before she turned back to the senior partner on her other side, deliberately drawing him into conversation and away from me. I checked my watch again. 10 minutes had passed. Lila would be arriving soon, with the DoD contract amendments. Documents that only the CEO of Meridian Technologies could sign, documents that would make it impossible to maintain the fiction I had lived with for so long. A strange calm settled over me as I considered what was about to happen. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired of the pretense, ready for whatever came. Next, if our marriage couldn't survive the truth about my success, then perhaps it wasn't a marriage worth preserving. The waiter approached our table, leaning down to speak quietly in my ear. "Sir, there's someone here asking for you. A Ms. Reynolds. She says it's urgent." Lila had arrived right on schedule. I nodded and thanked him, then stood up from the table. "Riley?" Celia questioned, her expression sharpening with annoyance. "Where are you going now?" My colleague is here with some paperwork I need to sign. Your colleague from the IT department? She made no effort to hide her skepticism. What could possibly be so important that they'd track you down at dinner? I didn't answer directly. I'll only be a moment. As I walked away from the table, I could feel Celia's eyes on my back, along with the curious glances of her colleagues. This was the point of no return. Whatever happened next would irreversibly change the dynamics of my marriage, and possibly Celia's professional relationships as well. Lila was waiting in the restaurant lobby, dressed in her usual impeccable style, a tailored charcoal pantsuit and crisp white blouse. She carried a sleek leather portfolio embossed with the Meridian Technologies logo. At 35, 5 years, my senior Lila had been with the company since the beginning, one of the first employees I'd hired. She had declined multiple promotions over the years, insisting she preferred her role as executive assistant to the CEO, a position that gave her unparalleled insight into the company's operations and made her one of the most powerful people at Meridian, regardless of her title. "Riley!" She greeted me with a professional nod, though I could see concern in her eyes. "I have the documents ready for your review and signature." She lowered her voice. "Are you sure you want to do this here?" I took the portfolio from her, hands feeling its weight, both literal and metaphorical. "Yes, in fact, I think it would be best if you came with me to the table. There are some introductions that should be made." Lila's eyebrows rose slightly. In the decade we'd worked together, she had become adept at reading between the lines of my instructions. "I understand. Lead the way." As we walked back toward the private dining room, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. Whatever came next, confrontation, revelation, transformation, would at least be based on truth. The compartmentalized life I had been living was about to collapse, and despite the inevitable fallout, I welcomed it. I paused at the entrance to the dining room, Lila a respectful step behind me. The Wilson and Moore party was still engaged in animated conversation, with Amelia Barrett holding court at the head of the table and Celia positioned strategically beside her, laughing at something the managing partner had said. For a brief moment, I observed my wife in her element, confident, ambitious, socially adept. I could appreciate these qualities in her, even as I acknowledged the darker side of her ambition that had revealed itself in how she treated me. Regardless of what happened next, this moment of clarity was valuable. I was seeing her, truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time in years. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, Lila following close behind with the portfolio that would change everything. Our return to the table didn't immediately interrupt the flow of conversation. A few heads turned as we approached, but most of the dinner guests were engrossed in Amelia's description of the firm's expansion plans. Celia noticed us first, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of Lila standing behind me with the leather portfolio bearing the Meridian Technologies logo clearly visible. "Riley," she said, her voice carrying a warning note, "we're still in the middle of dinner." I nodded politely and returned to my seat, gesturing for Lila to come stand beside me. "This will only take a moment. Everyone, please continue your conversation." But of course they didn't. The presence of a stranger, a professionally dressed woman with an executive bearing, had caught everyone's attention. Amelia Barrett paused mid-sentence, her sharp eyes taking in Lila and the portfolio she carried. "An urgent work matter?" Amelia asked, somehow making the question sound both polite and skeptical. "Yes," I replied simply. "This is Lila Reynolds." Before I could continue the introduction, Celia jumped in, clearly trying to control the narrative. "Riley's colleague, from the tech support team," she explained with an apologetic smile to the table. "I'm sure whatever it is can wait until—" "Actually," Lila interjected smoothly, "I'm the executive assistant to the CEO of Meridian Technologies." She placed the portfolio on the table in front of me, These documents require immediate attention, Mr. Parker. The table went utterly silent. I could feel the collective confusion as everyone processed Lila's words. Beside me, Celia had gone completely still, her face frozen in an expression caught between confusion and disbelief. Mr. Parker? The silver-haired senior partner repeated, looking between Lila and me with narrowed eyes. Reed Parker, I confirmed, opening the portfolio and scanning the first page of the contract amendment. Or Riley Reed Parker if you want to be formal. Most people just call me Riley. I could almost hear the mental connections being made around the table as the Wilson and Moore legal team, all highly trained in processing information quickly, began to understand what was happening. "You're Reed Parker," Amelia said slowly, her usual composure momentarily shaken. "The CEO of Meridian Technologies." "Yes," I said, initialing the bottom of each page as I reviewed the contract amendments. "For the past 12 years, since I founded the company." Celia made a small, strangled sound beside me. When I glanced at her, her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with shock and dawning horror. "Riley," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are you talking about?" I continued reviewing the document, answering her without looking up. "Meridian Technologies, the company you've been researching so extensively for your potential client pitch. I founded it after graduating from MIT. We currently employ over 300 people across 3 offices, with a 4th opening in Austin next month." The silence around the table had taken on a different quality now. No longer confused, but stunned. I could feel the weight of multiple stares as I signed the final page of the amendment with my full name and title. "These are amendments to our Department of Defense contract," I explained, handing the signed documents back to Lila. "Time-sensitive security protocol updates that required CEO authorization." Lila accepted the portfolio with a professional nod. "Thank you, sir. I'll have these delivered immediately." She paused, glancing around the table with a polite smile. "It's nice to finally meet you, Mrs. Parker. Riley speaks of you often." With that parting comment, which was both true and deliberately pointed, Lila nodded respectfully to the table and departed, leaving behind a vacuum of stunned silence. Amelia Barrett was the first to recover, her calculating mind obviously reassessing everything in light of this new information. "Well," she said, leaning forward with renewed interest, "this is an unexpected development. We were just discussing Meridian's potential legal needs." "So I heard," I replied, taking a sip of my water. "Though I should clarify, we're not actively seeking new representation. Jack Morris, my COO, has been exploring options as a due diligence exercise, but we're quite satisfied with Hendricks and Bell at the moment." Celia made another small sound beside me, something between a gasp and a protest. Her hand gripped her wine glass so tightly I could see her knuckles turning white. "Riley," she said, her voice strained, "can I speak with you privately for a moment?" I met her eyes directly for what felt like the first time in years. "I think we should finish dinner first, don't you? It would be rude to leave in the middle of such an important celebration." The junior partner seated across from me failed to suppress a smile at this response, quickly hiding it behind his napkin when Celia shot him a glacial look. "So, Mr. Parker," Amelia continued smoothly, "ever the professional even in awkward circumstances. Tell us more about Meridian's work. Celia mentioned you handle security matters, but I'd love to hear directly from you about your company's focus." And just like that, the dynamics of the entire dinner shifted. Where I had been virtually invisible before, I was now the center of attention, not because of who I was, but because of what I represented: power, influence, and potential business. Gave Amelia a brief overview of Meridian's core services, conscious of the proprietary information I needed to protect even in a room full of lawyers. Throughout my explanation, I could feel Celia beside me, rigid with shock and what I assumed was mounting anger or embarrassment. The senior partners began asking informed questions about cybersecurity challenges, clearly pivoting to demonstrate their expertise in the field. I answered each query thoughtfully, aware that while I had no intention of changing legal firms, these were still respected professionals in their field. I'm particularly impressed with your embedded security protocols. For infrastructure systems, the silver-haired partner commented. Your company's work on the Eastern Power Grid project was groundbreaking. I nodded in acknowledgement. That was a challenging implementation. We had to balance accessibility with maximum protection against foreign incursions. Foreign incursions, Celia repeated, finding her voice at last. There was a brittle quality to her words. You work on critical infrastructure? Among other things, I replied calmly. That project was 3 years ago. You were preparing for the Westfield case at the time. I remember you were too busy for dinner most nights. The reminder of how little attention she had paid to my work hung between us, unspoken but palpable. Several people at the table shifted uncomfortably, sensing the personal tension beneath our exchange. Amelia Barrett, ever the tactician, steered the conversation back to safer ground. Meridian's growth has been remarkable, especially for a company that maintains such a low public profile. Was that a deliberate strategy? It was, I confirmed. Our clients value discretion, and I've always believed that actions speak louder than publicity. We let our work define us, not press releases or social media campaigns. As I said this, I saw understanding dawn in Celia's eyes, the realization that my approach to my company mirrored my approach to our marriage. I had never hidden my success from her. I had simply never volunteered it, waiting to see if she would value me without the trappings of status and wealth. The dinner continued, with this new reality established. I answered questions about Meridian, offered insights on cybersecurity trends, and engaged with the lawyers as peers rather than as my wife's subordinate husband. Throughout it all, Celia remained largely silent, watching me with an expression that cycled between disbelief, anger, and calculation. When dessert was served, she finally leaned close to me, speaking under her breath. Why didn't you tell me? It was a loaded question, one that couldn't be properly addressed in whispers at a dinner table. This isn't the place for that conversation, I murmured back. You let me believe, she started, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself. She took a deep breath and continued more quietly. All these years, you let me think you were just another IT guy. I never said that, I replied calmly. I said I worked in cybersecurity. You drew your own conclusions, because you deliberately misled me, did I? Or did you never bother to ask meaningful questions about my work because you'd already decided it wasn't important enough to matter? The flash of guilt in her eyes told me my words had hit their mark. Before she could respond, Amelia called for everyone's attention to make a final toast to the team's success. As glasses were raised around the table, I noticed several of Celia's colleagues glancing between us with poorly concealed curiosity. The story of tonight's revelation would undoubtedly become office gossip by tomorrow morning. As the dinner finally wound down, people began saying their goodbyes. Several partners made a point of exchanging business cards with me, suddenly eager to establish a direct connection. Amelia Barrett approached us as we prepared to leave. Riley, it's been a pleasure getting to know you properly, she said, extending her hand. I hope we'll have the opportunity to discuss Meridian's legal needs further, despite your current satisfaction with Hendricks and Bell. I shook her hand firmly. Always good to maintain professional connections, Ms. Barrett. She turned to Celia, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Celia, I had no idea your husband was so established in his field. You've been quite modest about his accomplishments. The barb was subtle, but unmistakable. Celia's face flushed slightly as she forced a smile. Riley prefers to keep a low profile. Evidently, Amelia replied, before bidding us both good night and moving on to say farewell to other guests. As we collected our coats in silence, the weight of the evening's revelations hung between us. We had arrived as a couple with a clear power dynamic. Celia, the successful legal professional, me, the underachieving husband. We were leaving as something else entirely. The balance between us fundamentally altered. The valet brought my car around, the modest sedan I drove most days, rather than the luxury vehicles sitting in our garage at home. Another deliberate choice that Celia was now recontextualizing. I could tell from her expression as she slid into the passenger seat. As we pulled away from the restaurant, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with apprehension. 6 years of carefully maintained separation between my personal and professional lives had collapsed in a single evening. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the way things were before. The truth was finally out, and now we would have to face it. The drive home was dominated by a heavy silence, punctuated only by the soft hum of the car's engine and the occasional sound of Celia shifting in her seat. Neither of us seemed ready to begin the conversation we both knew was inevitable. The familiar streets passed by outside the window as I drove on autopilot, my mind replaying the evening's events. When we finally arrived home and stepped into our living room, the tension that had been building all evening reached its breaking point. Celia tossed her purse onto the sofa with uncharacteristic carelessness and turned to face me, arms crossed defensively over her chest. "Were you ever going to tell me?" she demanded, her voice wavering between anger and hurt. "Or was the plan to just let me look like a fool indefinitely?" I loosened my tie and considered her question. "Honestly? I don't know. I've been asking myself the same thing for years." "Years," she repeated, the word sharp with disbelief. "You've been lying to me for our entire marriage." "I never lied," I corrected her, keeping my voice level. "I just didn't volunteer information that you never actually asked for." "Don't play semantics, Riley." She threw her hands up in frustration. "You let me believe you were some mid-level IT guy when you're actually—" She seemed to struggle with the reality of it even now. "When you're actually the CEO of a major company, a company that my firm has been actively trying to court as a client." I sank into an armchair, suddenly feeling the weight of the day's events. "Would it have mattered, Celia, if you had known from the beginning who I was professionally? Would it have changed how you treated me?" "Of course it would have," she shot back immediately. I looked up at her, waiting for her to hear what she had just admitted. The realization dawned on her face slowly, and she had the grace to flush with embarrassment. I didn't mean," she stammered. "Yes, you did," I said quietly, "and that's precisely the problem. You would have treated me differently if you'd known I was successful. You would have respected me more if you'd known I had money. And power, what does that say about how you value people, Celia?" She stood frozen for a moment, then moved to the window, staring out into the darkness. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "You made me look like an idiot in front of my entire firm, in front of Amelia Barrett. Do you have any idea what that's going to do to my professional reputation?" "I didn't set out to embarrass you tonight," I said. "The situation with the DoD contract was genuinely urgent. But yes, I made a decision in that moment to stop hiding who I am. Maybe that was unfair to you, but this entire arrangement has been unfair from the start." She turned back to me, her expression hard to read. "What arrangement? Our marriage? The compartmentalization, the secrets, the fact that I've been watching you dismiss and belittle me for years without ever correcting your misconceptions." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Do you remember what you called me tonight, Celia, in front of all your colleagues?" She looked away, her jaw tightening. "You called me a nobody," I reminded her. "Not for the first time either. You've made it abundantly clear how little you think of me and my work." The only difference is that tonight, everyone at that table now knows how wrong you were. You set me up, she accused, but there was less conviction in her voice now. You deliberately let me make assumptions all these years. At first, it wasn't deliberate, I admitted. When we met, I wanted someone who would love me for who I was, not what I owned or what position I held. But you never showed much interest in really knowing me, Celia. You were too busy telling me about your own job, your own ambitions. That's not fair, she protested. I asked about your work. You asked what I did, and I told you, I work in cybersecurity. But you never asked follow-up questions. You never wanted details. As long as you had the basic label to file me under, that was enough for you. She opened her mouth to object, then closed it again, her brow furrowing as she seemed to search. Her memories for evidence to contradict me. Think about it, I continued. How many times have I sat and listened to every detail of your cases, your office politics, your strategies for impressing Amelia? And how many times have you asked me about my day beyond the most superficial questions? Celia moved to the sofa and sat down heavily, her defensive posture beginning to crumble. I thought I knew what your days were like. I thought... She broke, off shaking her head. I don't even know what I thought anymore. You thought I wasn't worth the effort of genuine curiosity, I said, the words holding the weight of years of observation. And over time, that transformed into active dismissal. You didn't just ignore my work, you began actively devaluing it, making comments about my lack of ambition, comparing me unfavorably to your colleagues' husbands, treating me like I was somehow less than you. She didn't immediately deny it, which was something at least. Instead, she stared down at her hands. I didn't realize how it sounded. I think you did, I countered gently. I think you liked feeling superior. It made you feel secure in your own achievements to think you had surpassed me. Her head snapped up, eyes flashing with a renewed spark of anger. You don't get to psychoanalyze me, Riley. Not after what you've done. What exactly have I done? Celia? Built a successful company? Provided a comfortable life for us? Never corrected your misconceptions about my professional standing? Which of these things is the unforgivable offense? You made me look like a fool, she repeated, her voice rising, in front of everyone who matters in my professional life. And you've made me feel like a fool for years, I replied, keeping my tone even despite the emotion building in my chest. In the privacy of our home, where it should have been safe to be valued for who I am, not what I do for a living. A heavy silence fell between us as the truth of my words hung in the air. Celia's anger seemed to deflate slightly, replaced by something more complicated, perhaps the dawning recognition of her own role in our dysfunctional dynamic. I never meant to. Make you feel undervalued, she finally said, her voice quieter now. But you did, I responded, consistently and deliberately. Tonight was just the culmination. You called me a nobody in front of an entire table of professionals. Can you imagine how that felt? She winced visibly. I was trying to position myself as an expert on Meridian. I didn't know you were... That's just it, Celia. Would it have been acceptable to call me a nobody if I really had been just an IT support person? Is that how you speak about people you perceive as having less prestigious jobs than yours? The question seemed to land like a physical blow. Celia's eyes widened slightly as she confronted the implications of her behavior. I don't... she began, then stopped herself. After a moment, she tried again. It's competitive at the firm. Status matters. The partners notice who you're connected to, who you associate with. So you distanced yourself from me professionally because you thought I would be a liability to your advancement, I concluded. You were embarrassed by me. She didn't deny it, which was its own kind of answer. The irony, I said with a humorless laugh, is that if you had actually taken an interest in my work, in who I really am, you might have found that I could have been an asset to your career, not a liability. That's not fair, she protested weakly. You deliberately hid your success from me. I didn't hide it. I just didn't broadcast it. There's a difference. I stood up and walked to the built-in bookshelf across the room, pulling out a leather-bound portfolio from behind some novels. This has been here since we moved in. My company profile, press features, acquisition records, all of it accessible if you'd ever been curious enough to ask about the details of my work life. I handed her the portfolio. She opened it hesitantly, her eyes widening as she flipped through pages of press clippings, industry awards, and financial statements that documented Meridian's growth over the years. This was just sitting on our bookshelf? She asked incredulously. Along with several technical books I've written under my full name, Reed Parker. They're on the second shelf, next to your law school textbooks that you insisted on keeping. I gestured toward the books she had likely never noticed. I never locked my home office. My laptop has always been accessible. You could have seen any of this at any time if you'd shown even a passing interest in my professional life. Celia continued, paging through the portfolio, her expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and what looked like genuine remorse. When she finally looked up, her eyes were shining with unshed tears. Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why maintain this fiction for so long? I sat down again, suddenly feeling very tired. It started as a way to find someone who would love me for me, not my success or money, but over time it became, I searched for the right words, it became a test I was never going to let you pass. Every time you dismissed me or my work, it reinforced my decision not to tell you. And every time I kept the secret, it made your dismissal seem more justified. We've been caught in this cycle for years. So this is my fault? She asked, but the question lacked her earlier defensiveness. No, I said honestly. It's both of us. I withheld important information about myself, creating a foundation of omission. You made assumptions based on that incomplete information and then treated me according to those assumptions. We both failed this marriage, Celia, just in different ways. She closed the portfolio and set it on the coffee table between us. For the first time all evening, perhaps for the first time in years, she was looking at me as if truly seeing me. Not the husband she had categorized and dismissed, but a person with depths she had never bothered to explore. Where do we go from here? She asked quietly. It was the question I had been asking myself all evening, ever since Lila had walked into that restaurant with those papers. The answer wasn't simple, but it was becoming clearer with every moment of this conversation. I don't know, I admitted. But I do know we can't go back to how things were. That version of our marriage is over. Celia sat still for a long moment, my last words hanging between us. Our marriage as we knew it was over. The question was whether anything could be salvaged from its ruins. She got up and returned with 2 glasses of water, sitting closer to me than before, a small but noticeable reduction in the distance between us. I've been horrible to you, haven't I? She asked quietly. The simple question, devoid of justifications, caught me off guard. I had expected more arguments, more attempts to shift blame. There have been moments, I acknowledged, especially in recent years. She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to our wedding photo on the mantel, a younger version of us, smiling, hopeful, unaware of how complicated things would become. When did it start? She asked. When did I begin treating you like that? It was gradual. After your first promotion, I noticed a shift. Everything became hierarchical. Who had which office? Who worked for whom? You started categorizing people by their professional status, including me. Celia winced, but didn't interrupt. Then, when you became Amelia's executive coordinator, it accelerated. You began making comments about my supposed lack of ambition. comparing me to your colleagues' husbands, dismissing my input on anything related to business. I remember the first time Amelia invited me to a partner's dinner, she said. She asked everyone about their spouse's work, nodding approvingly when someone mentioned a surgeon husband or a wife who ran her own business. And when she got to you, I said you worked in IT. She just said, oh, and moved on. No follow-up questions. I felt diminished, like I had failed a test. So you began distancing yourself from me professionally, I concluded, because you thought my perceived status reflected on you. She didn't deny it. The firm is obsessed with connections and influence, but that doesn't excuse how I treated you. I didn't just distance myself. I started looking down on you, treating you as if you were less. Why? I asked simply. What did that give you? Celia looked down at her hands. For the first time since I'd known her, she appeared genuinely uncertain. I think it made me feel more secure in my own achievements. If I could look at you and see someone who wasn't as successful as me, it validated my progress. She grimaced. God, that sounds terrible when I say it out loud. It's honest. I replied, there's more to it. The environment at Wilson & Moore is toxic in ways I've never admitted. Everyone is constantly jockeying for position. There's this culture of casual cruelty disguised as ambition. She looked up, troubled. I think I brought that home with me. The need to establish a hierarchy, and you were convenient. The person I could safely feel superior to. When you called me a nobody tonight, I said carefully, was that the first time you've thought of me in those terms? She flinched. No, she admitted after a pause. I've thought it before. Not constantly, but in moments when I felt insecure. At work, I would come home and think, at least I'm doing better than Riley. That must have felt awful for you, she added quietly, especially knowing what you actually do. I nodded. There were moments when I almost told you everything, when I wanted to show you the awards or tell you about a major contract. But then you'd make another comment about my supposed lack of ambition, and I'd decide to keep it to myself. A cycle, she murmured, each of us reinforcing the worst in the other. Celia walked to the bookshelf, pulling out one of my books. Advanced Protocols in System Security by Reed Parker, published 3 years ago. She turned to me. I remember when you were working on this. I assumed you were playing games or something. I never asked. No, I agreed. You didn't. That night at Amelia's dinner, the one you couldn't attend. What were you doing? Managing a security breach for a financial institution. If we hadn't contained it, thousands of people's banking information would have been compromised. She closed her eyes. And I accused you of checking firewalls or whatever. Yes. Riley, I'm so sorry, she said with genuine remorse. Not just for tonight, but for years of this, for never seeing you. I studied her face, searching for signs of the calculation I'd grown accustomed to detecting. But all I saw was raw honesty. We both failed this marriage, she continued. I treated you terribly, but you also withheld a fundamental part of who you are. What started as a desire to be loved for myself eventually became a test you couldn't pass because you didn't know you were taking it, I acknowledged. Do you think we could have had a different marriage if I had known from the beginning? I don't know, I answered honestly. Maybe we would have had different problems. Maybe you would have valued me for my status rather than who I am. That's not much better than devaluing me for my perceived lack of status, she nodded. I understand, but at least it would have been based on truth. My success is real, I conceded, but so is the person you've lived with. I may be CEO of Meridian, but I'm also someone who prefers quiet evenings at home and still can't fold laundry properly. A sad smile touched her lips. I know those parts. Of you, I just failed to value them properly. She leaned forward earnestly. Riley, I understand how badly I've hurt you. What I did was wrong, I chose to belittle you. I chose to dismiss your work. I positioned myself above you in some imaginary hierarchy. I appreciate you saying that, I said. It matters that you can see it now. Is it too late for us? She asked softly. I don't know, I admitted. But if there's any chance, it has to be based on complete honesty and genuine respect. Both have been missing from our marriage for a long time. Celia nodded, eyes bright with tears. I understand, and regardless of what happens next, I am truly sorry. You deserved better. The value of a person isn't determined by their job title or income. That, I said quietly, is perhaps the most important realization to come out of tonight. The days following our confrontation were strange. A careful dance of two people reassessing everything they thought they knew about each other and their marriage. Celia and I moved around our home with a heightened awareness, both of us trying to navigate our new reality. I suggested she take time to process everything, and she agreed. I need to really think about who we are and what we've become, she said, her voice steady but subdued. It was the first truly honest exchange we'd had in years. On Wednesday morning, 3 days after the dinner at Ellison's, I received a text from her while at the office. Can we meet for lunch? Neutral territory. We met at a small cafe halfway between Wilson and Moore and Meridian's downtown office, a place we'd never been together. When I arrived, Celia was already seated at a corner table, wearing her professional armor, a tailored navy suit that projected confidence. Yet her expression was softer than I'd seen in years, less guarded. Thank you for coming, she said as I sat down. Of course. After we ordered, she folded her hands on the table. Things at the firm have been interesting since Monday, I could imagine. Emilia, surprisingly decent, actually. She called me into her office first thing Monday. Morning, I was expecting a reprimand, maybe even a demotion. Celia smiled faintly. Instead, she said she respected how I handled the unexpected revelation with poise. Apparently, discovering your husband is a tech CEO at a professional dinner demonstrates admirable adaptability. Adaptability, I repeated with a slight smile. That's one way to frame it. It's all about saving face, she said, a hint of her old shrewdness returning. The firm was attempting to court Meridian as a client. Finding out the husband of one of their employees is actually the CEO. They've been researching. That changes the dynamic. Does it bother you, I asked, that your value to them suddenly increased because of your connection to me? It was a pointed question, but Celia didn't flinch from it. It should, she admitted. And 3 days ago, I would have been thrilled by the validation. But now, she shook her head. It just confirms everything wrong with that environment. They barely noticed I existed until they thought I might be useful to them. Her insight surprised me. This was a new level of self-awareness. What about you? She asked. How has it been at Meridian? Business as usual, I replied. The DoD contract amendments were approved. Jack's been fielding calls from Wilson and Moore's business development team, politely deflecting for now. An awkward silence fell between us as our food arrived. We both began eating, the mundane activity providing cover for the weightier conversation, hovering just beyond reach. Finally, Celia set down her fork. I've been thinking about what happened, not just at the dinner, but over the past few years. I've realized something important. I waited, giving her space to continue. I don't like who I've become, she said simply. The woman who would call her husband a nobody to impress her colleagues. That's not who I want to be, but I can't blame it all on the toxic culture at Wilson and Moore. I chose to participate in it, to embrace it. I let it change me. We all adapt to our environments, I offered, sometimes without realizing it. True, she acknowledged, but we're also responsible for our choices. For 6 years, I chose to diminish you rather than support you. And for what? to feel momentarily superior, to fit in with people who only value others for what they can provide. She shook her head. It's empty. I studied her, trying to gauge the authenticity of this epiphany. What are you saying, Celia? I'm saying I want to change. I've actually been considering leaving the firm. This genuinely surprised me. You've been working toward partner for years. At what cost? She asked. My integrity, our marriage, my basic human decency? She took a deep breath. I'm not saying I don't want a career or success, but I want it on different terms, terms that don't require stepping on others to elevate. Myself. Her words resonated with me, echoing thoughts I'd had about my own choices. I understand that, and I owe you an apology too. For what? She asked, seemingly genuinely confused. For not trusting you with the truth. Whatever my initial reasons, continuing to hide such a significant part of my life from you wasn't fair. It created an impossible situation. She nodded slowly. We both created this mess together. The question is, I said carefully, can we fix it together, or is it too broken? Celia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. The first genuine physical contact we'd had in days. I don't know, she admitted, but I'd like to try, not because you're a CEO or because it would be financially advantageous to stay married to you, but because underneath all these layers of miscommunication and hurt, there's still something worth salvaging. At least I hope there is. I turned my hand to hold hers properly. It won't be easy. We can't just go back to how things were. I don't want to, she said firmly. How things were was broken. If we move forward, it has to be something new, something better. Complete honesty, I said, recalling our conversation from the other night, and genuine respect, she added. Both ways. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of something I had almost forgotten. Hope. Not certainty, not a guarantee that we could repair what had been damaged, but the possibility that from the ruins of our old marriage, something authentic might emerge. Where do we start? She asked. I squeezed her hand gently. Maybe with getting to know each other again, really know each other this time. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. I'd like that. Could we start tonight? I want to see your office. The real one, not the one I've imagined all these years. It was a small request, but it represented something significant, genuine, interest in my professional life, something she had never shown before. I think that can be arranged, I replied. Meridian's headquarters isn't as impressive as Wilson and Moore's offices, but it has its charms. I don't care about impressive anymore, she said quietly. I just want real. As we finished lunch and prepared to return to our respective workplaces, I realized we were standing at the beginning of a long, uncertain road. Whether we could successfully remake our marriage remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, we were both facing the same direction, eyes open to the truth. That evening, I waited in the lobby of Meridian's headquarters for Celia to arrive. Our building wasn't as imposing as Wilson and Moore's downtown offices. I had deliberately chosen a more understated location when we expanded, but the security was state-of-the-art, and the interior reflected the innovative nature of our work. When Celia walked through the main entrance, she seemed almost hesitant, as if entering unfamiliar territory. In a way, she was. This part of my life had been completely hidden from her for years. "Hi," she said, approaching me with an uncertain smile. "Hi, ready for the tour?" She nodded, and I led her to the security desk, where Michael, our night guard, greeted me with his usual deference. "Good evening, Mr. Parker. Will you and your guest be needing anything special for your visit?" I watched Celia register his use of my actual name and title, another small reminder of the reality she was just beginning to understand. "We're fine, Michael, thank you. Mrs. Parker will need a visitor badge, though." He quickly processed the badge and handed it to Celia, who clipped it to her jacket with a strange expression, part wonder, part discomfort at being identified as Mrs. Parker in this context. As we rode the elevator to the executive floor, she turned to me. "How many people work here?" "About 200 at headquarters, another 100 or so at our other locations." "And they all know you're the CEO," she said, not quite a question. "Yes," I confirmed, "though many call me Riley rather than Mr. Parker. We have a fairly informal culture." The elevator doors opened directly onto the executive floor, revealing an open, modern space with glass-walled offices around the perimeter and collaborative workspaces in the center. Even at this hour, several employees were still working, some looking up briefly to nod respectfully in my direction before returning to their tasks. "This is where the leadership team works," I explained, leading her through the space. "Jack's office is there, our CFO Carla's is next to his, and the rest of the executive team is spread around the floor." I pointed out various departments, explaining their functions briefly as we walked. Celia listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about the company structure and security protocols. For once, she seemed genuinely interested in understanding my work rather than measuring it against some arbitrary standard. Finally, we reached the corner office with frosted glass walls and a simple nameplate. "Riley Parker, founder and CEO." "This is me," I said, opening the door and gesturing for her to enter. Celia stepped inside and slowly took in the space, the large desk with multiple monitors, the comfortable seating area for informal meetings, the wall of awards and recognitions I had never brought home. "It's not what I expected," she admitted, moving to examine the awards more closely. "Cybersecurity Innovation Award. Excellence in Government Contracting. Oh my God, Riley, this one's from the Department of Defense." I nodded. "For the infrastructure security project I mentioned. The one I was working on the night of Amelia's dinner party." She turned to face me, her expression troubled. "All these years, you were doing this level of work and I treated it like it was nothing." "You didn't know," I said, not to absolve her, but to acknowledge the reality. "I didn't want to know," she corrected. "There's a difference." She continued exploring the office, pausing at a framed photograph on my desk, one of the few personal items in the space. It was from our first anniversary, both of us laughing on a hiking trail, wind-blown and happy. "You keep this here," she said softly, picking up the frame. "Yes, despite everything, those early days meant something to me." She set the photo down carefully. "They meant something to me, too." After a pause, she asked, "Do you ever work late here, or do you usually work from home?" "Both. The home office is for routine work, for major security events or sensitive projects. I come here." She nodded, processing this information. "All those nights, I thought you were just avoiding me or playing computer games." "I was usually working," I confirmed, "but I never told you that either." We fell silent, both contemplating the years of miscommunication and wrong assumptions. "Would you like to meet some of the team?" I asked, breaking the silence. "There are always people working late on various projects." "I'd like that," she said, seeming genuinely interested. We left my office and walked through the development area, where I introduced her to several engineers and security specialists. I watched as she interacted with them, noting how she asked questions about their work with actual curiosity rather than the perfunctory interest she might have shown before. As we were about to leave, Lila appeared, files in hand. She stopped, short when she saw us together. "Riley, I didn't realize you were still here," she said, her eyes moving between us with careful neutrality. "Mrs. Parker, nice to see you again under calmer circumstances." "Lila," Celia acknowledged with a nod. "I wanted to thank you, actually. Your timing the other night was illuminating." A hint of a smile touched Lila's lips. "Just doing my job." "Very efficiently," Celia added, and there was no malice in her tone, just a recognition of Lila's role in bringing the truth to light. After Lila left, we made our way back to the elevator. As we descended to the lobby, Celia turned to me. "Thank you for showing me this," she said. "Your world. It's only part of my world," I replied, "but an important one." Outside the building, we stood for a moment in the cool evening air. "Would you like to get dinner?" I asked, uncertain where we stood. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not tonight. I need to process everything I've seen. But maybe tomorrow?" I nodded, understanding her need for space. "Tomorrow works." As she turned to leave, she paused and looked back. "Riley, I'm proud of what you've built here. I should have asked about it years ago." The simple acknowledgement meant more than I expected. "Thank you, that matters." We parted ways then, each returning to our separate homes with a new understanding, not just of each other, but of the long road ahead if we were to rebuild what had been broken. For the first time in years, though, that path seemed possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. And for now, that was enough. 6 months can change everything, or at least begin to. Half a year after that fateful dinner at Ellison's, Celia and I sat on our back patio, sharing a bottle of wine as the summer evening faded into dusk. We had developed a new ritual of weekly check-ins, dedicated time to discuss our relationship openly and honestly. "I had my exit interview today," she said, swirling the wine in her glass. "How did it go?" Emilia was surprisingly understanding. Said she'd been expecting it since... Celia smiled wryly. "Well, since the incident, as everyone at the firm still calls it. 2 months earlier, Celia had made the decision to leave Wilson & Moore, not abruptly, but after careful consideration of what she wanted from her career and her life. Did she try to convince you to stay again?" I asked. "Of course. Offered another title bump and a significant raise." Celia shook her head. "But it's not about titles or money anymore. This was perhaps the most profound change in her, this shift away from external validation towards something more authentic. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been setbacks, moments when old patterns threatened to re-emerge, but the effort had been consistent, genuine, and mutual." "Do you have any regrets?" I asked. "About leaving?" She considered the question seriously. "About leaving? No. About how I behaved while I was there? Absolutely. I look back at who I was, how I treated people, especially you, and I barely recognize myself." I reached across the table and took her hand. "We've both changed." And we had. In the months following the revelation of my position at Meridian, I had worked to dismantle the walls I'd built between my personal and professional lives. I brought Celia to company events, introduced her to colleagues, shared the challenges and triumphs of my work openly. "Reed called today," I said, using the name my employees often used for me. "The Austin office is exceeding projections already." "That's fantastic," Celia replied with genuine enthusiasm. "Will you need to visit again soon?" "Probably next month. Would you want to come along? You could meet with that legal aid organization while we're there." Her eyes lit up. "I'd like that." After leaving Wilson & Moore, Celia had taken time to reassess her career goals. The prestigious law firm track no longer appealed to her, but her legal skills and experience were valuable. She'd begun consulting with a legal aid organization that provided services to technology startups founded by women and minorities, work that utilized her expertise while aligning with values she had rediscovered in herself. "I had coffee with Michael yesterday," I mentioned. Michael was our COO Jack's husband, someone Celia had connected with during a company event. "How is he? Still dealing with that difficult client?" "Resolved, finally. He asked about you, wanted to know if you're still planning to join the foundation board." She nodded. "The meeting's next week. I'm nervous, but in a good way." The Meridian Foundation was our company's philanthropic arm, focused on increasing access to technology education in underserved communities. When a board position had opened, several employees had suggested Celia, not because she was my wife, but because her legal background and growing network in non-profit circles made her genuinely qualified. "You'll be great," I assured her. "They need someone with your perspective." As darkness fell, I lit the small patio fire pit, and we moved our chairs closer together, watching the flames dance in the gentle evening breeze. "I've been thinking about that night a lot lately," Celia said quietly, "at Ellison's." "What about it?" "How close we came to losing everything. If Lila hadn't walked in with those papers right when she did, I might never have told you the truth," I acknowledged, "and you might have continued believing I was someone to be dismissed." "We were both so lost," she murmured. "Me, in my desperate climb for status, you in your test that I couldn't pass because I didn't know I was taking it." I nodded, feeling the weight of our shared responsibility for the years of miscommunication. "Do you think we would have found our way back to each other without that moment?" She considered this thoughtfully. "I don't know. Maybe eventually. Or maybe we would have just drifted further apart until there was nothing left to save." The fire crackled between us, sending sparks upward into the night sky. "I'm grateful," she said finally. "Not for how it happened. I still cringe thinking about calling you a nobody in front of everyone, but that it did happen. That we got this chance to rebuild." "Me too. We weren't perfect. The patterns of years couldn't be undone in months. Sometimes Celia still slipped into status-conscious thinking. Sometimes I still withheld parts of myself out of old habits of self-protection. But we were aware now, catching ourselves, helping each other grow." "What made the difference, do you think?" she asked. "Why are we making it work now when we couldn't before?" I thought about this question carefully. "Honesty, obviously, but more than that, I think we both finally recognized that a person's value isn't in their job title or bank account or professional status. It's in how they treat others, how they show up in relationships, the integrity they bring to daily life." "The lesson I learned too late," she said with a hint of regret. "Not too late," I corrected gently. "Just in time." She smiled at that, leaning her head against my shoulder as we watched the fire together. "Just in time," she repeated softly. 6 months hadn't erased the past, but they had laid the foundation for something new, a relationship built on mutual respect, genuine interest, and the kind of honesty that comes from seeing each other clearly, perhaps for the first time. The revelation of my professional identity had been dramatic, even shocking in the moment. But the true revelation had been what followed. The difficult conversations, the painful self-examinations, the gradual rebuilding of trust. We had both learned that real connection can't be built on performances or masks or tests. It requires the courage to be fully seen and the wisdom to truly see others beyond the labels and titles we so often use to categorize human worth. That night at Ellison's, when my assistant walked in with those papers, she had done more than reveal my position as CEO. She had set in motion a chain of events that forced both Celia and me to confront the empty values that had nearly destroyed our marriage. In the end, it wasn't about being a somebody or a nobody. It was about becoming real to each other, flawed, complex, and worthy of love, not for what we did, but for who we were. And that lesson was worth every difficult moment of the journey. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.